Hello. So today we start earlier than we normally do. Normally these Friday events have us starting at 2:30, but today we start at 2. And so we're filtering in, getting ready to do that. I know we've got a number of people who are interested in today. I got to meet one person who's here, who's from India, but she has come to hear you, but she is from a northern part of India, not Bangalore, which is from the south. I see my friend Stephen Adolph here. Stephen grew up in Bangladesh, which is a northern part of India. No, I'm joking. I think that's very, it is a neighbor. That's the right way of saying it. A northern neighbor, but Steve's just hoping he has a chance to speak Bengali to somebody today. We've got a number of people from a number of different cultures and backgrounds. It's an honor to have you all here. I am deeply appreciative. I see we've got Avery Lamel, who's a pastor of ours at the Jersey Village campus of our church. I know we've got Jarrett Stevens, who's a senior pastor. Jarrett is over there. We've got all of our library and foundation workers here. And so we've got our neighbors, and we're just so glad you're here. I'm going to introduce the guests. We're going to start our dialogue. It will be on the internet also, so you can always go back, God willing. You can always go back and have a chance to gather information there. But would you join me in a word of prayer, please? Lord God, we thank you for today, for such a beautiful day outside for us, and for a chance to gather together here. We pray that you would give us insight and that your presence would convict us of things that we hear and learn. And we thank you so much for hearing our prayers. We offer these prayers through what you've done and who you are. Amen. So within the framework of this, I've got some papers here that allow me to give a more thorough introduction than I might do otherwise. So I'm going to start with Dean Fleming here at the end. He's a professor emeritus, which means he's retired, of New Testament and missions at Mid-American Nazarene University. His PhD is in New Testament exegesis from the University of Aberdeen. He's ordained in the Church of the Nazarene. He's received awards from Christianity Today, the American Bible Society, Coalition for Christian Colleges and Universities, has published a commentary on Philippians, has written on contextualizing the New Testament, and his most recent book, I believe, is Foretaste of the Future, reading Revelation in the light of God's missions. He has spent time living abroad fairly extensively, and so we will talk to him in a little bit, and you'll get to hear some of that. Sitting next to him is Randy Richards. Now, Randy's been here many, many times before, so he should look familiar to you. If he will probably tell many of the same jokes he's told every time before, too. He will sound familiar as well. He's a research professor of New Testament and the former provost at Palm Beach Atlantic University, which is in Palm Beach, Florida. Beautiful campus, great school. Before that, he was a New Testament professor at Ouachita Baptist University in Arkansas, where Jarrett Stevens attended, and is no doubt responsible for Jarrett's amazing preaching. His PhD is from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, where we've got some other professors who are here at the historically from there before they graduated and went to Lipscomb. We've got Randy served for 10 years in Indonesia, and a lot of people don't know that about him. He has co-authored with David Cates, our own David Cates, Rediscovering Paul, Rediscovering Jesus. He's got another book, Rediscovering More Junk. Rediscovering Other Stuff, excuse me. He's a best-selling author with InterVarsity Press, and he's got a book that's sold over 100,000 copies, entitled Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes. Now, all of us that grew up in a Western tradition read the Bible as if it's our own, as if we have the understanding about it. And yet the Bible's not a product of Western tradition. So it's going to be really an interesting focus of today on how we can better read and understand the Bible. You and your wife, Stacy, Richard and his wife, Stacy, are now living in Wisconsin. They moved to be near their grandchildren. With Becky and I expecting our 10th grandchild, we certainly understand. So it's a joy to have him. I'm going to wait on Havila for just a moment because she's our featured guest. So the last shall be first, and the first will be last. I'm going to come down here to Gene Green. Now, those of you who grew up watching Captain Kangaroo, that was Mr. Green Jeans. That's not the same as Mr. Gene Green, okay? He is a New Testament professor emeritus at Wheaton College. He served as professor of New Testament, dean, and rector of a seminary in Costa Rica, Central America. He's got his PhD from the University of Aberdeen. He's written commentaries in Spanish to 1st and 2nd Peter and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. He's got a great new book, Vox Petri, which is Latin for Voice of Peter, a theology of Peter. And he has written extensively on global theology, edits an important series of books with Langham Publishing on global voices. He and his wife, Debbie, live in Chicago or somewhere thereabout, and he loves jazz music, which is a variation of country and western. And then last and preeminently, Havila Dharamraj, close, is our honored guest. I got to meet her and found her just stunning in terms of her knowledge, in terms of her spirit, in terms of her personality, just a marvelous lady, probably 6 or 7 years ago when I was speaking at a Langham Partners event. And I've wanted her to come to the library to lecture ever since. She lives in Bangalore, Maine. Bangalore, India. So I don't care who you are. She traveled the furthest to be here today because that's truly almost around the globe. We had her scheduled to come in when COVID hit, and we had to cancel that. Travel was not possible, and we couldn't all gather together and meet. But she's graciously agreed to come this week. She will give a public lecture tomorrow night on reading Ruth. And the Ruth is an Old Testament book that deals with some very cultural concepts in the midst of expressing these marvelous passages about love and commitment and yet also a prophetic undertone to the whole book. And if you think you know Ruth, I would urge you to come tomorrow night because Ruth is closer to the culture that Havila lives in than it is our Western culture. And when we read it with our Western frame of minds, we run risk, not just misreading, but run risk of missing out on so much that's wrapped up in a cultural understanding of the book. So I'm really excited about tomorrow night, and I'll also get to interview her in church on Sunday morning, and I'm excited about that as well. She is the head of the Department of Biblical Studies at the South Asia Institute of Advanced Christian Studies in Bangalore, India. She has served as the academic dean for a period of 8 years. She has her PhD from the University of Durham in narrative theology. Her interest is in narrative preaching and storytelling, and she does workshops in those. She has published A Prophet Like Moses, a narrative theological reading of the Elijah cycle. She's an editor and contributor to the South Asian Bible Commentary series. She's written Altogether Lovely, a thematic intertextual reading of the Song of Songs. She's written on Ruth, a commentary on Ruth. She's married to Pandu. Am I saying his name right? They have 2 married children. She has a grandson, and she loves her dogs, and she loves gardening. So tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to get her to go work in the garden with us, and any of y'all who want to work in it are welcome to join us. Would you join me in welcoming this panel? Okay, I grew up in a place called Lubbock, Texas. It's the hub of the plains. And a lot of the people I grew up with thought that Christianity was basically, if not made for people from Lubbock, at least monopolized by people in Lubbock. We considered ourselves the buckle of the Bible Belt. Is Lubbock really the centerpiece of all things Christian, or does it exist outside of Lubbock? Where have you seen it? And I'm going to start, Havila, with you, because the perception of many is that if you came from India, you must either be Hindu or perhaps Buddhist, but something along those lines. And here you are, a Christian from India. Please tell us about that.
Well, most people who know something about church history think that Christianity came to South Asia with the British. That would be in the 1800s and onwards, the heyday of the colonial era. But to South India, Christianity probably came in the 1st century, just perhaps within a century of Jesus. India, South India, is a peninsula and has seaports. And so trading routes had been established between the Middle East, what is now the Middle East, and India, well back into Solomon's period, perhaps. And so it appears that the Queen of Syria asked for missionaries. She was a convert into Christianity. Let the trader ships take Christianity with them. And so we have a little tradition of Syrian Christians, Orthodox Eastern Church, that really prides itself on going right back to the 1st century after Christ. So that's as old as Christianity is in South Asia. Of course, it came again with the European missionaries, the Catholics especially, and then it came once again with the British. I am a 3rd generation Christian. My grandparents first received the gospel into their hearts. But I can say more about that later.
Okay, That's great. Thank you so much. Jean, Costa Rica, commentaries in Spanish. What is your experience with Christianity in other cultures?
My wife, Deborah, and I had the privilege of living in Latin America for 13 years. Our first cross-cultural experience, however, was in Scotland. And I never imagined that living in Scotland and learning about haggis would help us to adapt to the culture and life in Latin America. We were missionaries, as was stated, for about 13 years in Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic. And we were introduced to a conversation that I was never taught about when I was a student at Wheaton College or in my PhD program at the University of Aberdeen. There was a new development in theology that was happening across Latin America with people like Samuel Escobar, René Padilla, probably most well-known would be Gustavo Gutierrez. And what's happened, Mark, is that, the church has moved. We've, as was stated before, we thought that Christianity was centered in Lubbock, right?
Yeah.
I was taught it was centered in Springfield, Illinois. was
That's
became
a
Christian
suburb of Lubbock.
during the Jesus movement. And but in the year 1910, 82% of Christians lived in the North Atlantic region. 82%, and 18% lived outside of Europe, North America. In 2010, 61% of Christians live in the global South and East, and 39% in the global North. Projections are that in 2050, 77%, get this, 77% of Christians will live in the global South and East, and here in the North Atlantic region, 23%. The majority world, as it's often called, is a place where God is doing an absolutely marvelous thing with churches that are self-funding, self-propagating, self-governing, and self-theologizing. And it's an honor to be here with our sister, who is part of this new wave of God. As Justo Gonzalez, the Cuban-American theologian, church historian, said, that we are in the middle of a new reformation right now, with the rise of majority world biblical studies and theology. And we here are on the margins of Christianity. You realize that? That we are the minority. And there's a conversation that's going on across the globe. And so you're talking about Costa Rica? Gosh, we got to be part of that conversation. And our desire here is to share that conversation with you all. Latin American, Indian, South Asian, Indigenous, African. It's a marvelous thing that's happening.
That's fantastic. And I make the joke about Lubbock. That's not really true in the sense that it was in Lubbock that I was introduced to Watchman Nee. Reading all of the Watchman Nee, I don't think he actually wrote most of the books. I think they were written by his students about his teaching. But I understand, don't know this firsthand, that at this point, if you look at the missionaries in the world, the Christian missionaries in the world, the nation that sends out the most Christian missionaries in the world is China, which is fascinating. My younger sister is the CEO of BSF, Bible Study Fellowship. And she is constantly going around the world because Bible Study Fellowship has active chapters in the third world that have massive attendance. Third world, majority world is the right term for it. So anyway, all right, Randy, you've been outside, you've experienced Christianity outside of the United States. Give us your perception of whether or not our focus sometimes is askew because we tend to think we're the center of the universe.
I think in some ways it's fun that we do, so long as we allow my Indonesian friends to think they're the center of the universe as well. I would also encourage folks not to feel threatened by what Gene has rattled off. It means there are more Christians to hold hands with as we try to spread the gospel around the world. So having more people and chairs around the table is actually a blessing. I would never want to bash the West or anything like that. I think God has done some great work through Western Christianity, but we sure need some more people to help us. So I think I view it as a table, a family table at dinner. We're going to have more family members from around the world who do read it a little differently than we do. But my experience has been when I hear the way they read it, I'm delighted. And I look at that and I think, I didn't know that. So here's a story I told you before, maybe. I don't know what I've told you. The first time I read the story of Abraham having the 3 angelic visitors that come, so many of you will remember that story.
It's painted in that panel.
There you go.
Right there, second, not the bottom one, but the one to the left, right above it.
So there you go. So if you can read the Hebrew there later and be reminded. But my Lebanese friends, when they read that story, they brought the meal. They said, did you notice? I said, no. They said, Sarah didn't bring bread. Now, see, I had the same reaction you did. Like, what? First off, I never noticed. And second, I thought, well, it didn't really matter. He said they asked her, where's Sarah? So my experience has been when we're reading more globally, my often reaction is, wow, that's great. I never saw that. So I'm looking forward to it.
Good. All right, Dean, talk to us from your perspective. What does this make you think?
Well, I've had the privilege of living and teaching and ministering in places where there were people from many different cultures. I taught at a seminary in the Philippines where we had students from everywhere from Korea to Papua New Guinea and from Japan to Western Samoa. And we all lived together in one community, and I learned so much from those people. When I first went there, I had done all of my theological training in North America or in the UK. And so I was excited about all the things that I was going to impart to these students from Asia. And it didn't take me very long to figure out that a lot of the things that I was teaching them answered questions that they weren't asking. And I had to figure out what are the questions that they have when they come to the Bible and what kind of things are pressing in this context. And I heard them talking about things like poverty and riches and theology of suffering and the spirit world and the New Testament teaching on persecution. And these were things that I had not really studied in my education. And I had to go back to the Bible and begin to ask those questions of what Scripture said. And it was a great learning experience for me, and I learned a great deal from them. And then later on, I had an opportunity to teach in a very similar kind of institution in Europe, where we had students from Western and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union and the Middle East. And they had different questions as well, and I was learning from them. And then I had an opportunity to teach in Africa with some doctoral students from 6 different countries. And once again, that process went on. So I think I have become so much richer in my understanding of the Bible as a result of interacting with those people that God has placed in my pathway along the way.
If you don't know, in the Philippines, many of the people start celebrating Christmas September 1st and carry on throughout the rest of the year.
It's the Burr months.
Yeah.
Christmas is the Burr months. September, October,
November and December.
Yes.
The Burr months, B-E-R, the months that end in Burr. It's and it's also quite humorous because one of their favorite Christmas songs is, "Gee, it seems like Christmas was just here," as something to that effect, which frankly it was. Once they get to September and they're singing it again. Okay, so here's the question now. As we've set the table here, you've got majority world biblical studies. You've all taught in various places. Why is it we in the United States hear so little about the theology and the developments that are coming out of Africa and Asia and Latin America and Oceania and these various ways? Why do we have to come here to listen to this? Why is there very little out there for us? Who's up for it? Gene, lead us off.
I remember my own training, and we never heard anything about what was happening around the globe. And there were suspicions. I love Randy's approach to say that, we learn from our brothers and sisters across the majority world. But if you go to our bookshelves, if you go to our libraries, there are very few books that we see up there written by majority world authors. Also, within our theological curriculums, many, many schools have no courses whatsoever to introduce students to the perspectives that are emerging from our brothers and sisters across the globe. And I think a lot of times it's that our leaders in the church, our teachers, our pastors have never been exposed to the conversation globally, and often not even to the conversation here within North America. A lot of theological colleges, seminaries, Christian colleges don't have courses on African American theology, Asian American theologies. They definitely don't, there's a whole movement of indigenous, Native American and First Nations Christians who are thinking through the faith and offering us fresh visions of the faith. Indigenous Christians, often we don't read that. So I think a lot of it has to do with, what was that commercial, what's in your wallet? Remember that one? What's on your bookshelf? Do you have Davila's commentary on Ruth? Is it a first resource that you go to? And I think we in the West have to recognize, as Randy rightly says, that this is our common table. Now, I love the fact that we in Western theological education democratize the faith by reading the church fathers. Anybody like Luther? Calvin, I'll get more hits on Calvin, and we'll go back to the church fathers and we'll go back through church history. We'll read with them. Well, we also have a responsibility to read together around the globe, right? And recognize that this is our common table. One of my students many years ago at Wheaton College, we had a course on majority world theology. And I asked them, I said, why should we be reading majority world theology? And one of them raised their hand and he said, who gives them the right to be at the table with us?
Wow.
Isn't that shocking? But I had another student who rose up and said, who says it's your table? It's our common table. And as John Mbiti, the great Kenyan theologian, says, we've eaten theology with you. We've drunk theology with you. Why don't you want to eat theology with us? You're part of our subconscious as we think about Scripture and about the faith. Why aren't we part of your subconscious? So we are one church, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all, and in all. I celebrate Davila being here and the multitude of voices that she represents. It's a glorious day. It's a glorious day. But our theological colleges have to realize that, and our pastors and our leaders. I hope you'll go from this and ask them, what's on your bookshelf?
Mm-hmm. So, Davila, you've got your PhD. Now, that's not your first degree. You have a graduate degree in microbiology.
Biochemistry.
Biochemistry, it's a science. That's what I know. And you've got you've got a whole other area of your life where you've studied academically and just done extraordinarily well. Then you go and you study and get your PhD in the theology that you've studied in, but you did that in the Western world, and now you're back teaching in India. What are the resource materials that you're using to teach when you teach in India?
To answer your question is to also respond a bit to what Jean said. The majority world cultures are oral cultures rather than cultures that read. So if you ask the question, what's on your bookshelf? That's a Western question to a Western audience. I'm trying to explain why a bookshelf will lack resources, print resources from the majority world. I know it's true of South Asia, East Asia, and even Africa, that we talk, that we speak when we want to transmit teaching to the generation beyond us. So even today, I know that many of my colleagues will prefer to pick up speaking invitations rather than sit down in a room and write a book. And even till today, when religious teaching is done, it's mostly through song and dance. It's a multimedia thing. You can go on all night with people on a stage and with people like y'all in the audience, where the Hindu epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata stories from these epics are performed. So they are sung as a narrative while it's being performed as dance. So there's music and dance that goes together. So that's the tradition that we have mostly in the majority world, and perhaps that explains why we don't write.
Well,
Yeah.
we need to read what you do write, and that's part of the motivation.
I understand, but so that's a bit of a failing, I think, on our part, that we don't publish enough. And so I'm very grateful for Langham. I'm a Langham scholar. I'm very grateful for Langham that makes publishing opportunities possible for the majority world. We get sabbaticals, writing sabbaticals, so that we can dedicate ourselves to writing projects. And so I think slowly we are beginning to understand that to get our voices heard globally, we need to publish. So hopefully that's a phenomenon that will slowly begin to gain momentum. And then there's something that the majority world can offer to the Western bookshelf. Right now, I don't think there's so much to offer even.
So that's fascinating to me. Now, Jean, you've published in Spanish.
Yes.
Javila, how many languages do you speak?
1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, counting English, 5 maybe.
All right, so 5 languages, but you're publishing, which have they all been in
Only
English?
in English, yeah.
Have you thought about publishing in a different language?
It's a matter of proficiency. And it's a sad thing even that it's a good thing and a bad thing. The British legacy to India was mission schools. And in mission schools, we were taught to not just read and write in English, but to think in English. You see, so in urban India, nearly all of us from my generation, and definitely the generations beyond me, we think in English. So it's a big effort to even be able to speak fluently, like give a lecture or a sermon in another language. Some of us can do it, but some of us can't. And to write as fluently in another language possibly doesn't happen.
All right. Before I move to my next question, Randy or Dean, do y'all want to comment on anything that you've heard thus far?
Well, one thing I wanted to add to that, and I agree very much with what both of them have said, is that I think there sometimes may be a bit of an implicit bias toward things that come out of the West. So we tend to think that we have, in the West, I'm talking about, have the pure gospel or the pure theology, and then people in other parts of the world can adapt that or contextualize that for their particular situation. And the fact is, there is no pure theology. Now, our theology in the West is a contextual theology, just like everywhere else. And so I think we need to take seriously what is being done in other parts of the world and recognize that it has as much to teach us as the things that are being developed or written in this context. And I think maybe if we can get over some of those assumptions, that would help the process as well.
Randy, do you have anything to add before
I'd like to comment first on what you said about thinking in English. I cannot take a sermon notes that I've done in English and preach them in Indonesian because I just won't do the text that way. So I have to start and I'll be thinking in Indonesian while I'm writing that Indonesian. I would just go at it differently. But then I want to comment on what Gene said. I absolutely agree with what he said, but what I would say to all of you when you think, oh gosh, I don't read global theology. Well, don't go home and slam your fingers in a drawer. It will be okay. We live in a culture that discourages it. The proof of that would be to go home and look on your iPad and find your favorite news app, whether that's CNN or Fox, but find your favorite news and look at the headlines and then open up something like the BBC news app or Al Jazeera and you will see they're talking about all kinds of things going on in the world that are not in our American News app. So we live in a culture that doesn't tend to look past the borders. So it's not surprising that in our theology we don't either. We do need to do it. We need to become better global citizens all the way around, I think.
So if I'm hearing this right, I'm reminded of a dear friend of mine, Peter Williams. Now, Peter is the warden at Tyndall House in Cambridge. And when I got to know Peter over a decade ago, I guess, I asked him what he did for his quiet devotional time, because he spends time each day in the Bible. And he said to me, well, each day I try to read 3 chapters of the Bible. And my brain's listening to him, and I'm thinking, well, okay, I mean, a lot of people do that, that's kind of neat. He's as ordinary as the rest of us. And then he finished his sentence. He said, 3 chapters of the Bible each day in an ancient dead language. And I said, well, what are you doing right now? And I think at the time he was reading through the Peshitta. And he said, yeah. So then a couple years later, I said to him, well, which version are you reading now? Which ancient dead language? And he said that he had read through the Bible twice in all of the ancient dead languages that we have the Bible in. So he's changed now, and now he's reading it in modern languages, 3 a day. And I said, so what language now? And he said, well, right now I'm reading it in Swedish. Now, this fella teaches Hebrew at Cambridge. This fella teaches Greek. He translates it and reads it as easily as I read English. And I said to him, why are you reading the Bible in Swedish instead of just reading it in its original Greek and Hebrew? And he said, it forces me to read more slowly, and I can understand what other great scholars have thought about the passage by the way they translate it into Swedish. So it makes me wonder, how many of you have truly studied in books, Bible or otherwise, that were in a different language other than English? Anybody?
Probably all of us.
All right, so give us some examples. Where has it made a difference? Yeah, and I mean, that's not, they don't know what I'm asking. This is not scripted. I'm freelancing on them. So I'm asking them questions they've had no prep on. And that's a really tough one. So if any of you can go back into your brain and think of something you've read in a foreign language that made an impression.
The Beatitudes, blessed are the peacemakers. In Indonesian, of course, the most recent Indonesian translation translates it from English and says blessed. Okay. But that's actually a poor translation, because it really means that you fit in. It's the feeling you have when everything has come together. So they have a great Indonesian word for that. It means I just really, like a puzzle, like you put that last puzzle piece in and it just clicks in place. That's the feeling you get. And so what they were saying was, if you're a peacemaker, you fit into the kingdom of God. Isn't that wonderful? So it's not telling us these are the things, if you do these things, God will bless you. They were saying, if you do these things, it's proof that you belong in the kingdom of God. Woo, it got me.
Which is wrapped up in makaroi, the Greek word that's used there for blessed.
Yeah.
All right, more examples?
When I teach in a seminary, and so when we're studying a book together in Hebrew, I ask my class to do that translation, of course, from the Hebrew into English, but also to check alongside their translation from Hebrew to English what their vernacular Bible says. Now, if I have a class of 8 students, I'd probably have 6 language groups going on. So each one of them will refer their own language Bible alongside their translation. And so when they come to class, I say, does your vernacular language, your language, translate this verse any different from the usual English versions? And they'll say, yes. I'll give you an example, but from the New Testament, because that's more familiar perhaps. Now you have this hot button verse, John 3:16. And the usual, including the NIV, is God so loved the world, isn't it? But you will find that more current translations might translate like this. This is the way God loved the world. He gave his only begotten Son. So the God so loved the world, is not God so loved the world, but is God does, or God in this way loved the world. The so being a hangover from the maybe the King James family. Yeah. So then I say, class, let's see what your vernaculars did with this verse. Is it God so loved the world, or is it God does love the world, he gives up? And then, they start looking, and then we find that those vernacular versions that were dependent on, let's say, the King James family, probably translated it, God so loved the world. But the other ones that went back to the Greek and and took other help, probably translated differently. And so then their eyes are open to the fact that there's no translation that does it like perfectly, and that each translation brings something to the whole world of translation and Bibles that we have. And they get into the habit of reading translations side by side, including their own vernacular, and then maybe a couple of English translations, along with any Greek and Hebrew that they might have. Yeah, that humbles us a bit about, when we say this is the translation.
What a great example. That's wonderful. All right, Dean, Jean?
One of the joys of learning another language is that you do get opened up to a lot of different concepts that aren't currently part of your thinking. And one of them in Latin America is the word justicia. The teacher in me wants you all to say that with me. Justicia. Well, justicia is a translation for the term justice, but also righteousness. And I think that what happens in Latin America is that when they read about justification, they understand that it also has to do with righteousness. Now, I know we are sons and daughters of the Reformation, and we know the story of the centrality of justification by faith. But the Latin American brothers and sisters, they understand that justification by faith is related to, we have to think about justice. So there's a lot of discussion, more so than often we hear, about social justice, and which gets into the very fabric of Latin American theology, like with the Latin American Theological Fraternity. How do we bring justice into our world? Very key concept, and it starts with just how we translate Greek terms.
So I'll riff, jazz music, country music. I'll riff off what our jazz music aficionado has said by underscoring something. So in the English translation of the New Testament, you can go to a book like Romans, which is laden with this term. You get the word justice and justification and justify. You also get the word righteousness and made righteous. Those in the Greek are the same word. They all come from the DK family of words. And so you've got dikaiosune, and you've got all these different forms from this D-I-K long E, DK. But in English, our translators have had to choose between a Latin-based word which is justice or justify, justitia.
Mhm.
The Latin base from the Latin word for law or use, just, or a word that comes more out of our Roman heritage with righteous, not Roman, a German heritage with righteousness. And so you've got two different strands of the English language trying to do justice to this one word, when if you pick one, you lose the other. If you pick the other, you lose the one. But you're able to get both of them when you're reading it in Spanish.
That's it. That's it.
Wow, that's a great example. All right, Dean.
Just a very simple example. When I was in my doctoral studies, I was working some in German and French, and I discovered pretty early on that whether you're working in the original Greek or in German or French, the word you has two different references. In English, you can talk about you in the singular and you in the plural, and we don't really know the difference until we know the context. But in most other languages,
We fixed that in Lubbock, and y'all know we did. Go ahead.
yeah, I didn't. I grew up in the north, so I don't say you all. But so in a passage, for example, like 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16, Paul asks the question, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you?" Well, I think it's very easy for us to just read that through our more individualistic eyes, and Randy's an expert on that, and assume that he's talking about you individually, but actually it's in the plural, and in most languages it's written in the plural. And so he's talking about the church, that you, the people of God, are God's temple, and God's Spirit lives in you corporately. And even that simple little difference, I think, when you move from English to another language, makes a big difference in our theology and how we interpret much of what Paul says that is directed to the church and not just to a collection of individual Christians.
And that's profound. I had a dear friend who was eating, I think he'd done about a dozen donuts in one sitting. He was diabetic, and he was trying to lose weight. And I said to him, I'll just use the name John. John, you know that's like, how do I put this, John? I said, don't you know that your body is a temple of God? And he stuffed another donut and he said, so you want God to have a small temple? But he and I were misreading the idea of your body. Y'all are the temple of God. Misreading 1 Corinthians 3. Okay, so within the framework of this, someone might be saying something like, wait a minute, we've read Jude. Didn't understand the parts taken from the Assumption of Moses or the book of Enoch, but we've read Jude, okay? And verse 4 says that the faith was, how's it say? Delivered, given, once for all, handed on to the saints. So if that's true, why do we need to read the gospel in anybody else's eyes other than the way we've gotten it? I mean, is there a difference? How is this theology contextual? Yeah, go right ahead.
My favorite text to answer a question like that is the one that's usually preached at weddings. Is the last bits of Genesis 2 a favorite wedding text here? The little song that Adam sings over the woman when he first meets her, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And then, just where the chapter ends, there's this little line of instruction. The story stops, and the narrator puts out this prescription to its readers. And the prescription is, and this is why a man will leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife, and the two will be one flesh. That's a wedding text here as
Yes.
well. Yeah. So now, I wonder how one flesh is usually interpreted to a congregation at a wedding. It's how is it, Jean? How is one flesh usually interpreted?
I'll let you answer.
Therefore, John and Mary now.
It usually here has two different strands of interpretation. One is it represents the physical unity that the couple will enjoy in a marital
Sex.
relationship, yes. And the other is that their hearts will become knit together.
So, a perfect unity of mind.
Yes.
Make your decisions together, John and Mary. Talk to each other. Make sure you're in sync on things.
That's a progressive view. Some people would say more it's that you just find your heart in the other person. Bob Dylan had a line, "You're the other half of what I am."
Whatever that means.
Whatever, well. Yeah. That was right before he and Sarah Dillon got divorced.
Well, he won the Nobel Prize, so
Yeah.
we'll let that go. Now, from a cultural context, when we read it, it reads a little bit like this. Now, the phrase one flesh needs to be read in the light of what Adam says just a couple of verses up, which is, here now is this woman who is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. So you go to other parts of the Old Testament to check where else this Hebrew idiom occurs. Bone and flesh. Now in English, and most English translations, it's idiomatically translated as not bone and flesh, but flesh and blood. Because that's our English idiom that matches that. Bone and flesh. Where else do you get bone and flesh? You get it in one of the stories in Genesis where Jacob now has come to the house of his uncle Laban. And Laban receives him with open arms and says, "Of course, come and stay with me. Aren't you my bone and flesh?" You'll find it again in the David story, when the northern tribes come up to him and say, "Come be our king also. Aren't you our bone and flesh?" And somewhere in between, there's another bit where a certain judge, it's in the book of Judges, a chap called Abimelech, who is Gideon's son, goes off to a city called Shechem, which is his mother's city, and says, "Elect me as your king because I am your bone and flesh." You see, the parties here are male. The two parties are male, which means we are talking about kinship relationships. Now, the majority world understands this really well because most of our cultures are community-oriented cultures rather than being individualistic cultures. And so when we talk about kinship obligations, man, you're talking about an obligation that stands right on top of the pile of social obligations you might have. And that's why there are so many Indians in the States. Because if there's one Indian that comes here, he has obligations to bring half his family over, including his nephew and his nephew's cousin and his nephew's third cousin. See, it's a flesh and blood obligation. And that obligation transcends any obligation you can have to your wife, because your wife is from another family. She is an outsider. So in an Indian family, even though we don't live in big joint families so much anymore, the patriarch of the family, that is the father, will command the highest obligation of any man. It might even be his older brother who is the patriarch of the family. And such obligations are much stronger than the obligation you would feel to a wife. So this verse is totally countercultural. It's subversive to a shocking extent, where the man is now asked to replace the obligation he has to his kin, to his flesh and blood, to his bone and flesh. even to the one that's right on top of that hierarchy of obligations, even his parents who sit right on top of that hierarchy of obligations, they are to be displaced by a new obligation, not to somebody from another family, but somebody who now should be looked upon as a kin, as flesh and blood. You see, so we read it like that and we're thinking, oh man, imagine if all of us Indians did this with our spouses.
Wow. Okay. So that does a chain reaction in my brain, because I think about Paul saying that those verses are also speaking of Christ in the church. And so now bone and flesh with Christ in the church, and the obligations and the relationship that's established there takes on a greater depth as well. That's good. All right. We've still got 30 minutes to go, and I want to make sure that I don't leave this. But I would ask you this question. What would you identify as some of the central contributions of the various cultures that you have experienced? In other words, where are some contributions of those cultures, that way of thinking, that theology and the perspective that's a contribution to the Western world and to the way we think? And that's what you've in a sense been giving us. But I want to expand it beyond the example that Hafila just gave and have each of you comment as you can on this. And Gene, we may start with Latin America just because might as well.
I'll do this in English, okay? I think every one of us in this room has been deeply influenced by Latin American theology, whether we realize it or not. Somewhere locked inside of us are the voices of our Latin American brothers and sisters. Let me tell you what I mean by that. In 1974, there was a conference on world evangelization in Lausanne, Switzerland. And this was about the task before the church this side of the coming of Christ. And there were delegates from all over the world at this conference, including some very key Latin Americans. I think about René Padilla, the late René Padilla from Ecuador, and Samuel Escobar from Peru. René Padilla came in and presented a paper at Lausanne on the way the kingdom of God comes, not simply in word, what we think about evangelism, but it comes in word and deed, that the gospel, the evangelion in Greek, comes in both word and deed. And so he presented that. And then Samuel Escobar presented a paper on the social responsibility of the church in a conference on world evangelization. Out of those two papers came the 5th paragraph of the Lausanne Covenant, which has become a standard doctrinal statement, missiological statement for the church. And let me read to you just a few lines from it. We affirm that God is both the creator and judge of all people. We therefore should share his concern for justice and reconciliation throughout human society and for the liberation of men and women from every kind of oppression. This is on an evangelical document on world evangelization. Because men and women were made in the image of God, every person, regardless of race, religion, color, culture, class, sex, or age, has intrinsic dignity because of which he or she should be respected and served and not exploited. 2 Latin Americans gave their input at Lausanne. The late John Stott was the one that drafted the Lausanne Covenant. And many years ago, I was speaking with John Stott, Uncle John, as he's belovedly known. And he's told me that, he said, Gene, we had 2 copies, 2 editions of the Lausanne Covenant. One with this statement of social responsibility and one without. the delegates at Lausanne voted on which was going to be included. And the fifth paragraph on Christian social responsibility got in there because of the Latin Americans and the vote of our brothers and sisters in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Oceania. Now, when I was brought up as a young Christian studying theology, social dimension of the gospel, that's just for those liberals over there. And it took a couple of Latin American brothers to say, no, social concern is part and parcel of the gospel of Jesus Christ. What a miracle.
Amen. And if any of you have any doubt about whether or not that's influenced you, one of the people greatly influenced by that put it into work and writing, was a fella named Francis Schaeffer. And Francis Schaeffer wrote about it in terms of the way we treat the environment, pollution, and the death of man. Wrote about it in terms of, he was one of the big people to deal with euthanasia issues, the pro-life issues, from cradle to the grave and even pre-cradle. And it grew out of an understanding from this has permeated our Christian thought, and we have others to thank for it. That's a great example. Okay, who else? I mean, we've got Japan, we've got Oceania, we've got Southeast Asia, we've got India. Give us some more examples of where things have affected, whether we realize it or not. We're better because of what's happened.
A couple of examples that come to my mind. I've had an opportunity.
We'll get you closer to the mic.
Yep.
There you go.
I've had an opportunity to teach in the Middle East and in places like China a couple of times, where the reality of persecution is very much something of daily life for Christians. I've always struggled with the passages in the New Testament that talk about Christians being persecuted and assuming that's a normal state of things. And I think it was not until I had an opportunity to interact with people for whom that was a daily reality that I began to understand something more of the cost of what it meant to be a true follower of Jesus, and that had a great impression on my life as well. When I was growing up in the church, we didn't talk much about spiritual powers or the powers of darkness, and it was students in Africa and from Papua New Guinea that made me more aware of the realities that they faced in their world on a regular basis. I didn't think much about the shame that was associated with the crucified Jesus until I began to hear how students from Eastern cultures and from countries like Korea, Japan, and Indonesia saw that as such a crucial aspect of the meaning of the death of Christ and what it meant to identify with Jesus Christ. So I think if we are willing to listen, these things can help us have a broader and a richer understanding. It doesn't mean that we forget what we've learned and replace it with something else. I think it can help us to become richer in our understanding of the Bible and the gospel that we live out.
So the presentation of the gospel that we find in Romans, we call it the Romans Road. My Indonesian friends, my Papuan friends particularly, find it very confusing. What I used in evangelism there was Colossians, and I would start with the line, "Do you live in fear of the spirits?" So I tell my students here in America, try going door to door with that line as the opening line. But for them, it made perfect sense. But what I think I learned more, so I'm going to be very personal. Gene does global evangelism. I'm going to be very my own experience. There's a Dutch sociologist that ranked cultures from the most collectivist on a sliding scale to the cultures that are most individualist. And most of them are clumped here. And then there's two cultures that are just way out of line with the rest on the side of individualism. In fact, they're so individualistic, they make everybody else look collectivist. Those two cultures are the US and the UK. So we are just so individualist. And my experiences abroad have taught me to read the Bible better. It's not me, it's we, as you pointed out in your example.
Avila, you kind of started this with the Genesis 2, bone and flesh. Do you have something you want to add before I start peppering with two more areas?
It's more a question to the audience, if I may just ask a sort of rhetorical question. I wonder how many in the gathering here have been watching The Chosen?
How many have watched The Chosen?
That's quite a few. Yeah, so it's I think well researched, but my New Testament colleagues should attest to that. You have a cast that's Jesus has an Egyptian father, the man who does Jesus. Yeah, so it's a Middle Eastern mixed cast, and they speak in Middle Eastern accents. And as you've gone through those episodes, I wonder if you're able to see how the culture in which the Gospels are grounded is quite different from your Lubbock culture, for example. I don't know if you're able to see that there is a bridge to be made, to be built, carefully and cautiously built from wherever you are, even from wherever I am, into the culture of the Bible. The Gospels, the rest of the Bible is not acultural, it's not culture neutral. And so we all need to consciously build those bridges very carefully, and with the help of the Spirit, we need to build those cultures in so that we can understand the text better.
Excellent. All right, two last areas, and I think we've got time for both, and then I'll give you all a finishing question if we have it. One, so a buddy of mine was in India, and he was at some home, kind of a home type church service, it seems. And it looked like, and I've seen the videos, a woman was demon possessed, and it was a chilling video to watch. Bible obviously speaks of demon possession, but I'm curious, in your third world, there's always a narrative in the West of, well, demon possession, or is it just someone's having a mental breakdown, or is it, something that's we've got some diagnosis for it under the DSM-5 or something like that. Have you experienced in your work in other cultures demon possession or demon expression, which may be a foreign experience to many of us in the West? And if so, are you comfortable talking about it?
I had a student who was in one of my classes in the Philippines, a Filipino student who was a pastor, and he came to class one morning and he said, last night at our prayer meeting, we cast out a demon from a lady who was attending our church. And he talked about it almost matter-of-factly, as if this was a common experience. And that was not very long after I had arrived there, and it really caught my attention, and I realized that was very much a part of the ministry of the church in that part of the world. And it wasn't something that they thought was so unusual that they expected God to be more powerful than the powers of darkness that would afflict people there.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there are Christians, there are many turning to Christ, especially in North India, through exorcisms because of spectacular healings of demon possession. So there's a great wave of conversion across North India simply because of this. I remember when I was doing my PhD in Durham in the UK, there was a Kenyan who was also doing his PhD with a very well-known and established New Testament scholar, James Dunn, as it happened. And they were doing those texts about powers and principalities. And the Kenyan came to it one way, and James Dunn came to it a totally different way. And at one point, they even locked horns on how to go about it further. And the Kenyan was ready to pack up his bags and return simply because what he was being asked to do with his research wasn't matching the reality back home, where spirits and powers and principalities were real and almost something that they dealt with on a daily basis. It was an unseen reality. But yeah, someone intervened, and finally the Kenyan got to finish his PhD thesis, which just shows how it's two different worldviews. And when a majority world person reads Jesus' exorcisms, we immediately identify with it.
Interesting.
I think my first encounter with some serious theology around demons came in Aberdeen, Scotland, of all places. The Reverend Willie Still, the late Willie Still, on Free Church minister. Remember, we were at church one time, and Willie Still was a rather short man, a powerful preacher. When he prayed, you felt like you're in the presence of God. It was absolutely amazing. But I'll never forget the sermon where he came up and he stood up and he just kind of came up over the pulpit. He said, "Little children, don't forget the devil." And we all went, "Who?" And that was it. And he recognized, as a church, Free Church of Scotland minister, that we're in this battle, conflict, not with flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers. We read within our African theologians, the understanding of the clash between the powers is very much part of the fabric, whereas, as happened in Durham and happens at Wheaton and happens at other theological colleges, we don't talk about the devil, but the devil's real.
Now, and Randy, I want you to do this, but I will add my perspective on this is if Satan is real, then there's clearly a God. And I'm convinced that in the Western world where Satan is trying to persuade people there is no God, one of his principal tools is to persuade people he doesn't exist either. And so we don't see so readily in the Western world these expressions of Satan and the dark powers that are best explained by understanding that Satan and the dark powers. Because if people in the Western world realize that spiritual dimension exists in the evil realm, by definition, then it's got to exist in the heavenlies, in the godly realm as well. And so I think there's a reason why we don't see it so readily in the Western world, where other cultures already know what we don't know. And I think it changes also, is one of the reasons I've written it down to talk about. I think it changes our perspective on things when we hear something from the majority world that, frankly, we're not encountering here in America. In most corners. That's not to say it's not there, but not in most corners. Randy, what would you add?
I will give an anecdotal comment. I don't have verses for this, but I have experienced those kinds of encounters much more often where there's idolatry. And I don't know how that works, but places where there's been idolatry, I've experienced it more. I was in a Dayak longhouse, and it's a tropical rainforest, so it's hotter than blazes. So I was sleeping outside with everyone else, just on the porch, I guess. It's the middle of the night. It's made out of flimsy bamboo. And something was running right up the bamboo porch and stopping at my sleeping bag and turning around and running back. And did it 2 or 3 times, and I thought, some kid is pranking me, and I can't sleep with all this racket. So I fished around in my sleeping bag for my flashlight. I thought, I'm going to scare the dickens out of this little boy. So boom, 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 comes right up on me, and I pull my flashlight out, and I click it, and there was nothing there. Just about peed in my pants, actually. And that'll make you pray all night. So the next morning, the Christian pastor that I was with, the diac, he said, how'd you sleep last night? And I thought, I'm just not going to lie to him. I said, I didn't sleep well at all. And he said, well, there was a spirit, I guess we'd say, a spirit loose in the house. I thought, there sure was. And then he pointed to a fetish that was up on the wall. He said, I think it comes from that. So I agree with you very much, Mark. I think that Satan has a winning strategy here in the States, so he's going to stick with it. But that strategy doesn't work in some other places. I think there are places like the U.S. where we don't see the manifestations, but there are places that do. And staying off the front page is his U.S. strategy, as you pointed out, but it doesn't mean he's not very active.
Oh, amen. All right. Last general area before I ask you to tell us whatever you want to that I didn't have the wisdom to ask. I want to talk to you about evangelism in your part of the world. You know, here in the United States, we write books and we come up with programs and we figure out how to share the truth about God's love, how he expressed his love in the John 3:16 way, by reaching into our lives to show us his love and to provide for us. How do you evangelize within the worlds and the cultures in the majority world that you're surrounded with? And I want all 4 of you to answer, so don't fight to the finish line.
I was thinking about, as you're asking the question, about caravanas de buena voluntad, caravans of goodwill, which in Costa Rica was bringing medical care to rural communities where there was absolutely no medical care at all. I think about my wife, Deborah, who ran a medical clinic in a village, Bate, outside of Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, a very poor place where mud floors and one water spigot and machete fights. That is part of evangelism. That on the cutting edge of bringing the gospel to people is demonstrating the gospel. In fact, we find that. And it accompanies, it goes right along with that verbal proclamation. I was at churches in Guatemala and Honduras, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, where it was very often that a church, a mother church, would have preaching points in Campo Blanco, in white fields, they would call it. And very often these daughter churches would grow up very quickly, far beyond the mother church. So you have these 2 dynamics of the gospel going out, both in word and in deed and in praxis. In some communities, I've worked also for a number of years with indigenous Christians, Native Americans and First Nations in Canada, and their evangelism is extremely hard because the gospel has been used as a bludgeon against them. They lost land, they lost life, they lost culture, all in the name of Jesus. And we have a deep problem in America in the way that we have treated the first peoples of the land. How do you tell an indigenous person
about the good news of Jesus when all the gospel is meant to them has been bad news. So a lot of it comes by listening. I think evangelism in the indigenous community starts with hearing. Acompañar, we would say in Spanish, walking alongside, being part of it, listening. And really for us as members of the church to own. Evangelism begins by owning our own failures in the way that we first brought the gospel to them and acknowledging that and doing what we can to empower them to reach their own people. I think about an organization, a Christian evangelical organization called NATES, an Indigenous Learning Community, which is a group of people like Terry LeBlanc, and they've had Ray Aldred and Randy Woodley, and others who have been thinking through these very issues of contextualization and bringing the gospel to their people and focusing in ways that are resonant within indigenous communities. So it all depends on the community. It differs from community to community, as you rightly acknowledge.
Great. Thank you.
I agree with Gene that evangelism has to be contextualized. It has to fit the particular setting, just like theology does. I think we see examples of that in the Bible itself. If you look at the ministry of the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, when he evangelized a crowd that was associated with the synagogue from basically Jewish background in the city in Antioch, he talked about it in terms of the story of Israel and how God fulfilled their hopes for Messiah in the line of David. And he used a lot of scripture and spoke into a Jewish context there. But then a few chapters later, you see when he's in Athens speaking to a group of educated philosophers, he takes a very different approach. In fact, he doesn't quote scripture at all. He quotes a pagan poet or two. And he speaks in language that communicates the same basic message, but it uses concepts that would have connected with Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. And he challenges the idolatry that was very much a part of the pagan world at that time. Same gospel, but very different way of evangelizing people. And I think that's true as well today. I think in our own context, we have to find that connection point, and I've seen it in different ways. For example, when I've taught in creative access countries where evangelism was illegal, it's got to be done very much in a non-visible way, non-public way, more of a person-to-person relationship, and that is a very effective form of evangelism in that context. In Western Europe, which is a highly secularized context, many of my students are starting coffee shops as means of reaching secular people who would never come inside a church. And I think in this country as well, we find ways that fit the context if we're going to truly reach people who are outside the walls of the church.
Well, Dean is the master at this, and I would actually commend his books to you if you're interested more in this subject. I've learned a great deal from him on that. I do think he's exactly right. Paul varied his approach. We need to vary our approach, including in ways that we might not think. One of my Papuan students, who's a wonderful, wonderful minister, I said, "How did you become a Christian in central Papua?" He said, "My uncle had been out. He came back to our village and he announced our family is now a Christian village, a Christian family. He was wiser than I am. And if he said Christianity is right, then I knew it was right."
Wow. Avila?
Yeah, to follow on from what Dean was saying, I'm a third generation Christian. So growing up, I remember I was taught that to share the gospel, you did the ABC. This was, I think, came out of America. The Navigators brought it to my youth fellowship, I remember. ABC, which was you first accept that you're a sinner, B, so you believe in Jesus, and C, you confess. I don't know if you remember that ABC. Accept, believe, confess. Now that's very logical, but Western logical. So how would you share the gospel with your Indian neighbor here in the States if he or she is a traditional Hindu? What they believe in is reincarnation. So if they're good enough in this life, they will be reincarnated into something better. The starting point has to be to address the worldview first. Not reincarnation, but one life. It is ordained that a human has but one life, and after that, the judgment. Yeah, so the starting point is somewhere else, not in the ABC. Or a Muslim neighbor who believes in fate, who as good as he is right through this life and follows the 5 foundational requisites of Islam, doesn't really know at the end of his life whether Allah will move him up into heaven or down into hell, because Allah is sovereign and arbitrary. So how do you share the gospel with Muslim then? The starting point is somewhere else. It's not in the ABC. It is in the understanding that it's not fate that rules your final destiny, but it is your free will here to accept Jesus as your savior, and that moves you into either this place or that. So the starting points for sharing the gospel varies depending on the culture and the worldview and the faith and beliefs of the person you're sharing the gospel with. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
That's great. All right, we have 2 minutes left. That divides up to 30 seconds apiece. What did I should have asked you? If not, I'll advertise for tomorrow night. So
I have so many.
Go.
Resources. Quick and easy resources for understanding how other cultures, how other regions may read the Bible. Langham has a series of single volume commentaries that are published from various regions of the world. So we have the South Asia Bible Commentary, we have the Africa Bible Commentary, there's a Latin American one, there's one from Eastern Europe, one from the Middle East. I think we're doing one from China now. If you would like to have a commentary to read alongside your daily devotional readings, I'd say this is a really good resource because this is written from the perspective of a particular region, and you get into how different cultures.
That's a wonderful point. This is a book on my shelf, edited by Gene Green, whoever that fella is. Majority World Theology, Christian Doctrine in Global Context. This came out fairly recently, didn't it?
Well, this is a 7-year project. It originally came out in 6 distinct volumes, and InterVarsity Press wrapped it up into one. It's close to 50 scholars from Africa, Asia, Latin America, with some North American voices working around our basic theological tenets on God and Christ and the Spirit and so on. So it's a good way to begin to listen in these short essays of about 6,000 words each to what's happening in the different regions of the world, including among indigenous Christians.
And there are the other resources that Havila has just discussed that are available in your local theological library, which I would urge you to find. It's located, if you Google map it, you'll find it to be about a 1.5 minute walk that way. Would you join me in thanking everybody? Thank you.